My name is Christopher Hulburt. I'm a cadet at Virginia Military Institute, and my research project was entitled We Take What We Want, Rudyard Kipling in the Post-Colonial Age. In 2018, students at the University of Manchester painted over a mural of Rudyard Kipling's poem If in their student union and replaced it with one of Maya Angelou's entitled Still I Rise. This incident, like many others across the world, brings to light contentions about the ways that we accept and admire the figures of our past. While I adore and have adorned Kipling, I realize that not everyone feels the same way. Far from the lofty comforts provided by If are the controversial verses of The White Man's Burden. The argument around this poem has depleted Kipling's reputation and his legacy, yet many people happily read his other works, including The Jungle Books or his Just So stories. Why is this so? We remember and we interpret what we want from Kipling's collection, finding comfort in what feeds our own aspirations and conveniently condemning whatever is left. To understand Kipling is to understand him as a journalist, a poet, a novelist, a father, and an imperialist all the same. His reputation and his subsequent status as a subject of interest have declined since his death. I intended to analyze Kipling's poetry through a post-colonial lens. Specifically, I provided a contrapuntal reading of the selected poems and critical analyses. This frame of reading, summarized by George Wilson, encourages an interpreter to, quote, interweave, mutually qualify, and above all, superimpose the legitimate claims of intrinsic readings of a work, along with the claims of various forms of external critique. In short, it encourages us to incorporate our own perspectives into the understandings of literary works. Said recognized that no one is insular from the political happenings or circumstances of their lifetime. Thus, we treat ourselves with the same attributions and credibility as we treat Rudyard Kipling when analyzing his poetry. The two sections of my research balance my own perspectives with the conversation currently having taken place in academia. A good place to start analyzing Kipling's complete verse is in the piece which received a Nobel Prize for Literature, Kim. This novel focuses on a young orphan whose life on the streets enabled him to navigate the strata of Anglo-India, a protagonist who echoed sentiments of Kipling's own childhood in the subcontinent. These stories were well received by a patriotic and zealous public in the Victorian period. Yet this reception would change as the Great War tainted the public's conception of empire and of warfare. My research focuses on Kipling's poetry, explicitly his poetry on warfare and imperialism predating World War I, and those immediately following his son's disappearance during said conflict. My two major contentions thus far are as follows. A number of Kipling's poems offer evidence of his devotion to the tradition of empire, rather than to its individual institutions. And secondly, our modern conception of Kipling neglects his lifelong experience, a two-sided man caught between his identity as an Englishman and his identity as a foreign Indian. I came to revere Kipling by reading The Widow at Windsor, published in 1890, where Kipling actively contrasts the harsh experience of the common soldier at war with the lush leisure of Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle. Then here's to the sons of the widow, wherever however they roam. Here's all they desire if they require a speedy return to their home. Poor beggars, they'll never see home. It's worth noting that despite living a cosmopolitan lifestyle and being a lauded writer, Kipling retained at least a symbolic understanding of the plight of the common soldier, enlisted to fulfill the Queen's wishes, sometimes at the cost of his own life. This concern for the soldier's experience at war would become distinct and intimate sorrow, as his own son, John Kipling, would go missing in action during the Great War. Kipling's The White Man's Burden encouraged U.S. intervention in the Philippine Islands during the Spanish-American War because he believed the U.S. to be capable and necessarily willing to rule the islands with the same energy, honor, and beneficence that characterized British rule in India and Africa. While modern audiences may disagree, Kipling was challenging the Americans to take on the burden of imperialism, saying to the American public, in effect, that inquiring and acquiring an empire is a grueling and unrewarding business. Kipling's poem is equally a celebration of and a fair and forewarning about the commitments that imperialism entails. Interpreting this poem necessitates a degree of willingness to understand the poetry and its craftsmen in the time of its publication and of its reception. Can a man be so certain and yet so fallible simultaneously? Yes, he can. Recessional is written as a plea to God for grace and protection over the Queen's armies and navies. This appeal to Christianity is consequential in two ways. First, it questions the Queen's ability to ensure or determine England's future. Secondly, Kipling employed biblical references methodologically to leave a resonating warning to his audience, most of whom would have been brought up on the authorized version of the Bible. Thus, Kipling issued a warning and a plea to the English Empire to question the cost of its imperial endeavors. Undoubtedly, Kipling's impressions of life outside the British Isle definitely influenced his works. The Two-Sided Man serves as an epigraph to a chapter in Kipling's novel entitled Kim. Kim is purported to be Kipling's love letter to India, the land where he was born and raised. There are multiple similarities between Kim and Kipling. Both boys, being Anglo-Indians born in India, were able to circumnavigate the castes and classes that defined Anglo-Indian society. This blessing allows Kim in the novel to see and explore the subcontinent, but it becomes a curse as he must choose one identity to cherish, at the cost of part of his identity. It's apparent that the separate sides of Kipling's head refers to the separate and at times opposing stimuli throughout his life, Eastern and Western, British and Indian. This divide in identity and experience defined Rudyard Kipling's early life and would only grow wider with time. The Veterans, a brief poem crafted for the gathering of survivors on the 50th anniversary of the Indian Mutiny or Rebellion of 1857, provides an impressive example of Kipling's parallel sympathies to both England and India. Kipling, as a man who loved his birthplace and his nation-state equally, would mourn the tragedy of 1857 by its human loss. We find solace and solidarity between a man and his separate spheres. The last milestone in Rudyard Kipling's life that both precipitated and emphasized his duality as a lover of idyllic imperialism and as a two-sided man was the loss of his son, John Kipling, during World War I. My Boy Jack and Epitaphs of the War present two poems by which this trend is most observable. In this anthology, Kipling created an in memoriam tribute for all those who died at sea, conveying words of stern comfort for those who mourned them. It's plausible that Kipling's sentiments of grief and remembrance were rooted in his own sorrow. Common Form most thoroughly divulges the morose temperament of Rudyard Kipling at the end of World War I. The poem in its entirety is recited as such. If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied. I chose to scrutinize Common Form because it's remarkably similar to Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est. Did it take John Kipling's disappearance and presumed death in combat for Kipling to realize that the realities of imperialism were not only theoretical, but very, very real? One may come to study the life and works of Rudyard Kipling from stylistic admiration, personal devotion, or even intellectual dissent. In any case, there's no separating Kipling's writings from his own circumstances. There should be no parsing his words from the political or cultural context of his lifetime. I've intended to present two dimensions of Kipling that have been relatively neglected in contemporary literary and humanistic studies, both of which necessitate more conversations about race, political imperialism, and confrontation of the shadows that exist in our shared societal past. Since George Floyd died on May 25, 2020, protests and demonstrations have been held around the United States and abroad. In both major cities and small towns across America, Americans are expressing dissent and distress about the current racial relations and concern for the future of our country. When I wrote this epilogue, lines had been drawn differentiating between non-racism and anti-racism, indicting each American unwilling to voice their concerns over our current affairs. Truthfully, I don't know what remedy will end the disorder in our society. I know not whether our current efforts will utterly avert injustices and discrimination in the future. Nonetheless, I believe these conversations to be useful and necessary in the pursuit of a more perfect union. The sentiments and controversy which surrounded Kipling's writings have become more relevant now than ever. Why defend a man who has been memorialized as a jingo imperialist, morally insensitive, and aesthetically disgusting? I adore Rudyard Kipling for his style of writing and for enduring the personal tragedies of his own life. This work will not be a final judgment of Kipling's character. Hopefully, though, it will also not be deemed a futile resource in future postcolonial discussions. The forces at play in Kipling's admiration for empire were far more complex than scholars have acknowledged them to be. The forces at play in our current conversations about racial relations cannot be synthesized into polarizing and uncompromising camps. We know that historical figures like Kipling, just like us, were imperfect, but we should also recognize that understanding and acknowledging their prejudices, without dismissing their place in history altogether, may contribute to our quest for a more universal and a more equitable tomorrow.